Hi. From now on, I'll be splitting each devlog into two parts. First, I will talk about some part of the design and the game. And second, I'll present you with the major progress I've made in the past 2 weeks. For the design section today, I'll tell you a little bit about the economy. Okay, so let's start with an example. Every faction will have to worry about satisfying its citizens, so that's the best point to start. Usually, pops will have a lot of different demands, like education, food, housing, security, and stuff like that. But for the sake of keeping things simple, I will just focus on food. First things first, before you even start thinking about producing food, you'll need to make room for farms on your station. But because you're in space, you can't just grab some land and say, hey, produce food here. You'll need to dedicate a part of your station specifically for growing plants. If your station's not big enough, you'll have to expand it first. Okay, so after some weeks of construction, you finally have a sector of growth up and running. But from here, the fun only begins. After the sector is constructed, corporations will start buying shares of it. It will take some time before the corporations prepare the land for cultivation, but after that, the production of food will begin. Each unit of food will require labor and some resources. For food specifically, that will be volatiles and organics, so essentially fertilizer and seeds. And of course, organics and volatiles will have to each go through their own production chain. Each resource will essentially have 3 layers of complexity, or rather already has, because that's what I've been programming in the past week. First, its potential for production will be controlled by the government. They will be the ones to decide the direction of the economy, but not its trajectory. Corporations, or state firms if you're a commie, who will be the ones to decide that. Because it won't matter how many green sectors you build on your station if nobody wants to invest any capital there. Of course, as the leader of the ruling party, you'll have some say over subsidies and preferential taxation. And if that doesn't sound like enough, I recommend you to pick the collectivist ideology. Okay, amazing, so we have our farms up and running, but there's one last layer of complexity we have to worry about, and that layer is the market. Because ultimately, it will be the price of labor and intermediate goods that will decide economic success. When there's a shortage of electronic components, for example, corporations that produce devices or computers will start going under. Now, replace electronic components with food, and you'll have a much more interesting situation. Is your market open to foreign trade? Or maybe you're being blockaded by a bigger faction? Because a food shortage can mean anything from people being slightly grumpy because food prices are higher, to the citizens coming out on the streets because they're starving and wanting the head of the person responsible for causing the situation. And well, everything I've described up to this point sounds like a lot of fun to me. My vision for the game relies very heavily on simulation. Because although 4X games with like 4 or 5 resources and no serious simulation of the economy might be fun to play, they're not as satisfying to watch unfold. And just to ease your worries, I'm not trying to make Dwarf Fortress with its infinite complexities. I just want to focus on creating systems that help create a very compelling story. So even though my game will track things like GDP, the education level of your population, and the unemployment rate, I won't bother with adding orbital mechanics for the stations and planets, because even though it would add some depth to the game, it wouldn't outweigh the cost of sacrificing my current plan for representing how the system looks, which will just be a simple to understand hex grid. So all in all, the goal is to create an interesting and complex world which the player will be able to affect, even though they won't have a chance at understanding how every system in the game interacts with each other. The 4 most important systems that will underpin everything in the game will be the economy, which we talked about, the people and your faction, which will all have their motivations and agendas, your station's society, which could range from a mindless population of drones in a totalitarian state to an active force working in unison against you when you're still in the early stages of a totalitarian regime. And lastly, other factions, each having to worry about their own economy, own politics, and own society, and each wanting to come on top in international politics. Frankly, that's a lot of work, which is why I'm doing these devlogs only once every other week. I've been making progress faster than I hoped, and I'm on pace to release the basic demo in August. It will only be the 3 of the 4 major systems, as you won't be able to interact with other factions yet. But it will be more than enough to start testing whether the game will be any fun at all. And the earlier I can start testing, the earlier I can get rid of bad ideas that just won't work in the finished product. Don't get too excited though, because we're talking about some really bad programmer graphics. And unless you really want to see something different in the Forex genre, I instead recommend you to finally finish this game of Stellaris you started some time ago. Okay, now for the second part of the video. This is progress I've made over the past 2 weeks. I implemented classes in society. Each of them will have their own ideology and economic stats. Next, I implemented the logic for corporations. They can sell shares, take on debt, and strategize to make the optimal investments in the economy. New corporations have a chance to form every month from your society's investment fund. Each week, a percent of your GDP will be put there. That fraction will depend on your policy and your wealth. Poor people invest almost nothing, while the richest countries might invest something like half of their entire GDP. Next thing I implemented is scarcity. If there aren't enough resources in an economy, some corporations will simply be unable to produce goods. This also applies to labor. If you have 100 factories, but only have enough people to run half of them, they will function at 50% capacity. Next thing, I implemented the data for buildings and commodities. Everything you see here on the screen is fully functional. Next up, I created the framework for NPC AI. Their decision-making process is about 80% functional to what I want to have in August. They have motivations and personalities, which already weigh their choices, but I still haven't implemented the content for 90% of the actions they take. Finally, I'll mention that I'll have to rewrite the corporation and market logic in C#. The language in Godot is mostly concerned with ease of use rather than performance. But even though it's really slow for the processing power I'll need in the finished product, it's good enough for the first demo, because there will be only the player faction to simulate. So, that's about all the major changes I've made in these past 2 weeks, meaning that this is the end of this devlog, and I guess see you in half a month. If you want to follow the project, you can subscribe to the channel